The sticky note had curled at the edges, its pale yellow turned to amber with time, the ballpoint ink faded, but still legible in cheerful loops. "Coffee's ready." Gregory Caney pressed it carefully back between the pages of the leather-bound volume, his hands trembling slightly as he surveyed the sparse room his newest tenant had occupied for the past 8 months. The man had paid 6 months in advance when he'd arrived, then another 6 without complaint, always in cash, always exact to the penny. Now the room stood empty, the bed made with military precision, not a single possession left behind, except this book, and the note preserved within it like a pressed flower. The landlord had found it on the nightstand, placed exactly in the center as though it had been meant to be discovered. Gregory ran his fingers over the embossed cover, some foreign script he couldn't read, and felt an odd weight settle in his chest. The lodger had been strange, certainly. Pale as moonlight, hair like spun silver falling past his shoulders, always dressed in clothes that seemed a century out of fashion, yet somehow looked expensive. He'd kept to himself, paid on time, and never once complained about the thin walls or the temperamental heating. And now he was simply gone, as if he'd never existed at all. The story, of course, had started differently. 8 months earlier, when the winter rain hammered against the windows of the boarding house on Ashford Street and turned the world gray and bitter, the stranger had arrived without warning. Gregory's daughter Grace had been in the kitchen, flour dusting her forearms as she kneaded bread dough with practiced efficiency, when the bell above the front door chimed. She'd wiped her hands on her apron and pushed through the swinging door to find him standing in the entry hall, dripping rainwater onto the worn floorboards. Her first thought, unbidden and startling, was that he looked like something out of a painting. Not the cheerful modern kind, but the old oil portraits in museums, all severe beauty and aristocratic bearing. His hair hung wet and heavy over his shoulders, white blonde strands clinging to a face carved from marble. His eyes, when they met hers, were the color of winter storms, gray and deep and impossibly old, despite the fact that he couldn't have been more than 30. "I need a room," he said, and his voice carried an accent she couldn't place, something that spoke of old universities and older courts. "Long-term if you have availability." Grace had recovered quickly, offering the professional smile she'd perfected over 3 years of running the boarding house's daily operations, while her father handled the business side. "We do. Top floor, corner room, quiet, private bathroom, 200 a week, utilities included." He'd reached into his coat without hesitation and produced a roll of bills that made her eyes widen. 6 months. In advance. She'd shown him up the narrow stairs, acutely aware of how he moved behind her, silent as a shadow despite his height. The room was small but clean, furnished with a bed, a dresser, a writing desk beneath the window, and a worn armchair by the radiator. He'd surveyed it with an expression she couldn't read, something between resignation and relief. "The kitchen serves breakfast at 7, dinner at 6, Grace had explained, lingering in the doorway. "If you need anything else, there's a diner 2 blocks east, grocery store 3 blocks west. I'm Grace Holloway. My father owns the building." "Gideon," he'd replied after a moment's pause, as if he'd had to remember his own name. "Gideon Korvath." She'd left him then, returned to her bread dough and the comfortable routine of the kitchen, but she'd found herself thinking about him throughout the evening, about the way he held himself like royalty despite the worn edges of his coat, about the sadness that seemed to emanate from him like cold from ice. He hadn't come down for dinner that first night, or breakfast the next morning. In fact, Grace didn't see him again for 3 days, and when she did, it was by accident. She'd been hauling bags of groceries up the front steps at dusk when she'd spotted him returning from wherever he spent his days. He'd materialized from the shadows between streetlights, moving with that peculiar silence, and had taken the bags from her hands before she could protest. "You don't have to," she'd started, but he was already climbing the steps. "Where do they go?" "Kitchen, through the hall, back of the house." He'd carried them effortlessly, setting them on the counter with care, and she'd found herself studying him in the better light. His skin was even paler than she'd remembered, almost luminescent, and there was something about the way he held himself that suggested coiled strength, predatory grace held in careful check. When he turned to leave, she'd spoken without thinking. "You haven't eaten anything since you arrived." He'd paused, his back to her. I have specific dietary requirements. I take care of my own needs. Everyone needs to eat. I manage." His tone had been final, but not unkind. "Thank you for your concern, Miss Holloway." And that, she'd assumed, would be the end of it. But Grace had always been the sort of person who noticed things. She noticed that Gideon never left his room during daylight hours. She noticed that he wore gloves even indoors, and that he avoided the common areas when other tenants gathered. She noticed that despite his claim of taking care of his own needs, she never saw him bring food into the building, never heard the sounds of cooking from his room, never found evidence of meals in the trash. She also noticed, with growing curiosity, that he was unfailingly polite on the rare occasions when their paths crossed. He held doors, spoke with careful courtesy, and always said thank you for things that didn't require thanks, like she'd done something extraordinary by simply existing in the same space. It was peculiar. He was peculiar. And Grace, who'd spent 3 years managing a boarding house full of peculiar people, found herself more intrigued than she'd been by anyone in a very long time. The 4th night after his arrival, she'd been working late in the kitchen, preparing tomorrow's bread, when she heard soft footsteps in the hallway. She'd glanced up to find Gideon in the doorway, and this time his expression was different, uncertain, almost vulnerable. "I apologize for disturbing you," he'd said. "I was heading out and I smelled—" "Is that cardamom?" She'd smiled despite herself. "Cardamom and cinnamon, my grandmother's recipe. Makes the whole house smell like Christmas." He'd stood there for a long moment, something complicated crossing his face. "My mother used to bake bread with cardamom, a very long time ago." The way he said it, long time ago, made it sound like centuries rather than years. Grace had wiped her hands and moved to the coffee maker, an old but reliable drip machine that lived in perpetual operation on the counter. "I just made a fresh pot if you want some. It's probably terrible for you to drink coffee at midnight, but I won't tell if you won't." "I shouldn't." "You should," she'd countered, already pouring a cup. "House rule. Anyone who comes into my kitchen after 10 has to keep me company. Otherwise, it's bad luck." She'd seen the corner of his mouth twitch, not quite a smile but close. He'd stepped into the kitchen properly then, accepting the mug she offered with both hands, cradling it like something precious. He hadn't drunk from it, she'd noticed, but he'd held it and inhaled the steam, and some of the tension had eased from his shoulders. They'd talked for an hour that night, or rather, Grace had talked and Gideon had listened, occasionally offering brief comments that revealed startling depths of knowledge. He'd known obscure historical facts, could quote poetry in languages she didn't recognize, and had opinions about architecture that suggested he'd seen the buildings in question firsthand when they were new. It should have been strange, but instead, it felt comfortable, easy. When he'd finally excused himself, setting the still full mug in the sink with a murmured apology, Grace had watched him go and felt something shift in her chest, something warm and dangerous and entirely unexpected. The next morning, she'd found herself thinking about him as she prepared breakfast for the tenants, about the way he'd held that coffee mug like a lifeline, about the bone-deep loneliness she'd sensed beneath his careful courtesy. On impulse, she'd torn a sticky note from the pad by the phone and scribbled quickly, "Coffee's ready." Then she'd climbed the 3 flights to his room and slipped it under his door before she could talk herself out of it. That had been the beginning, though she hadn't known it at the time. Gideon had come down that evening just as she was finishing dinner prep, the sticky note folded carefully in his palm. He'd looked at her for a long moment, those storm-gray eyes searching her face as if trying to understand a puzzle. "Thank you," he'd said finally, and his voice had been rough with some emotion she couldn't name. "That was kind. It's just coffee." "No," he'd shaken his head slowly. "It isn't." He'd stayed while she finished cooking, sitting at the kitchen table in silence, and when she'd poured herself a cup of coffee and settled across from him, he'd spoken again. "May I ask you something, Miss Holloway?" "Grace?" "And yes?" "Why do you run a boarding house? You're young, educated, I suspect. You could be doing anything." She'd wrapped her hands around her mug, considering. "My mother died when I was 21. Cancer. My father sort of fell apart afterward. They'd been together since high school, and someone needed to keep things running, so I dropped out of university and came home. That was 3 years ago. You gave up your own life. I built a different one, she'd corrected gently. It's not what I planned, but it's mine. I like taking care of people, making sure they have a warm place to sleep and decent food to eat. There's honor in that. Gideon had stared at her with an intensity that should have been uncomfortable, but somehow wasn't. You believe that. You truly believe there's honor in small kindnesses. I do, don't you? I'm not certain I know what honor means anymore, he'd admitted, so quietly she almost missed it. I thought I did once. I was wrong. Grace had wanted to ask what he meant, but something in his expression stopped her. Instead, she'd refilled his untouched cup and changed the subject to something lighter, and had been rewarded by that almost smile again. It became a pattern after that. Gideon would appear in the kitchen most evenings, always after dark, and Grace would pour coffee she knew he'd never drink while they talked about everything and nothing. He never spoke about his past in concrete terms, but she pieced together impressions, wealth, wants, education, positions of authority, and then some betrayal, some loss that had left him hollow. Why do you pretend to drink the coffee? She had asked one night, 3 weeks into their strange routine. You never take a sip. He'd gone very still, his fingers tightening on the mug. When he looked up, his eyes were careful. Would you believe me if I said I have a medical condition? I'd believe you have a secret, Grace had said, and that it's yours to keep. I'm just curious whether you know that I know you're not actually drinking it. I know, he'd set the mug down. I like holding something warm. I like the smell. I like that you keep offering it even though you must realize I never touch it. It feels... He'd trailed off, searching for words. Human, normal. As opposed to? As opposed to what I am. The weight of that statement had settled between them. Grace had leaned forward, elbows on the table. And what are you, Gideon Korvath? Someone who doesn't deserve your kindness. I'll be the judge of that. He'd laughed then, a short, startled sound that transformed his face. You should be frightened of me, Grace. Should I? She'd studied him carefully, this strange, sad man with his silver hair and old-world manners. I don't think so. I think you're about as dangerous to me as a declawed cat. You're wrong. Prove it. He'd held her gaze for a long, taut moment, and Grace had felt her heartbeat quicken, not with fear, but with something else entirely. Then he'd stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. I should go. You always should go, she'd said softly. But you keep coming back. He'd paused in the doorway, backlit by the hall light, looking like something out of a Gothic painting. You're right. I do. After he'd left, Grace had found the sticky note sitting on the table, smoothed flat like he'd been carrying it in his pocket. Her chest had tightened with an emotion that felt dangerously close to tenderness. The weeks had blurred together after that, winter melting slowly into early spring. Their evening conversations had grown longer, more personal. Gideon had begun to relax around her, the careful guard he kept lowering by increments. She'd learned that he loved classical music, that he'd traveled extensively, that he read voraciously in 6 languages. She'd learned that he was deeply, almost painfully lonely, and that for reasons she didn't fully understand, her presence seemed to ease that loneliness. What she hadn't learned was what he actually was, but Grace had always been observant, and the clues had accumulated like snow, the way he only appeared after dark, the pallor of his skin, the occasional flash of something inhuman in his eyes when he forgot to guard his expression, the way he moved, too fast, too fluid, the fact that in 3 months he hadn't aged a day, hadn't caught a cold, hadn't seemed to need sleep or food or any of the things normal humans required. She'd done research, late at night on her laptop, feeling ridiculous but unable to stop herself. And when she'd finally admitted the impossible truth to herself, she'd felt not fear, but a strange sense of rightness. Of course he was a vampire. Of course. It explained everything. The question was what to do about it. She'd decided, in the end, to do nothing. To simply continue as they had been, pouring coffee he wouldn't drink and offering a strange, broken man the gift of ordinary human companionship. If he wanted her to know explicitly, he'd tell her. If not, she'd respect his secret. But then, 2 months after that first sticky note, everything had changed. Grace had been closing up the kitchen after dinner service, humming to herself as she wiped down the counters, when she'd heard voices in the front hall. Raised voices, which was unusual. The boarding house was generally quiet, its tenants mostly solitary people who valued privacy. She'd pushed through the swinging door to find three strangers confronting Gideon at the base of the stairs. They were like him, she'd seen immediately. Same otherworldly beauty, same pale skin and predatory grace. But where Gideon held himself with careful restraint, these three radiated barely controlled violence. The woman in front had hair black as midnight and eyes like chips of ice. She'd been dressed in black leather and moved with a warrior's confidence. "Your Majesty," she'd said, and the title had dripped with irony. "We've been searching for you for months." Gideon's entire body had gone rigid. "Katerina, you shouldn't have come." "We had no choice?" One of the men had stepped forward, tall and broad-shouldered with copper-red hair. "Severin has taken the throne. He's destroying everything you built. The old families are either bowing to him or being eliminated. It's a bloodbath, my lord." "I am no one's lord anymore, Michael. I abdicated. I walked away." "You ran away," the third stranger had corrected coldly. This one was slender and blonde, with a face like a Renaissance angel and a voice like winter wind. "After Isolde's betrayal, you couldn't bear to remain, so you fled and left us all to suffer the consequences." "Nikolai," Gideon had said, and there was warning in his tone. "I made my choice. A coward's choice." Grace had seen Gideon flinch as if struck, and something protective and fierce had risen in her chest. She'd stepped forward before she could think better of it. "Excuse me, but this is a private residence. If you're going to have this conversation, take it outside." All four vampires had turned to stare at her. The three strangers had looked at her like she was a particularly interesting insect. Gideon had looked at her like she'd just walked into a burning building. "Grace." His voice had been tight. "Go back to the kitchen, now." "Not until you tell me what's going on." Katerina had laughed, the sound sharp and cruel. "Oh, this is precious. Your Majesty, have you been playing house with a human? Does she know what you are, what you were?" "Leave her out of this." "I'm standing right here," Grace had said, crossing her arms, "and I can speak for myself, thanks. Now, I don't know who you people are, but Gideon pays his rent on time and doesn't cause trouble, which is more than I can say for some. So either state your business or leave." Mikhail had studied her with something like approval. "She's brave, foolish but brave." "She's under my protection," Gideon had said, moving to place himself between Grace and the others. "You will not touch her, you will not threaten her, you will not even look at her wrong, or I will remind you all exactly what I'm capable of." There had been something in his voice then, something ancient and absolutely lethal, and Grace had felt a shiver run down her spine. This was the predator beneath the gentleman's facade. This was what he'd been warning her about. Nikolai had raised both hands in a placating gesture. "No one wants to harm the human, Gideon. We're here because we need you, because the Covenant needs you. The Covenant can burn for all I care." "You don't mean that," Katerina had insisted. "You gave centuries to building our society. You created laws that protected us and allowed us to coexist with humans peacefully. You can't have stopped caring just because one person betrayed you." "Isolde wasn't just one person." Gideon's voice had been raw. "She was my intended queen, my partner, my closest advisor, and she conspired with the old guard to assassinate me because she thought I'd made us too weak, too human." Grace had processed this, her mind racing. Queen, throne, covenant. Gideon wasn't just a vampire, he was vampire royalty, and he'd been betrayed by someone he loved. "The assassination failed," Mikhail had pointed out. "You survived. You executed the conspirators, including Isolde, according to the law you yourself had written. Justice was served." "Justice," Gideon had laughed bitterly. "I executed the woman I loved, Mikhail. I looked her in the eyes and I drove a stake through her heart because the law demanded it, because I'd built a system that couldn't tolerate treason, even from a queen consort. So yes, justice was served, and it destroyed me. I abdicated the next day because I finally understood that I had no business ruling anyone when I couldn't even see betrayal in the person closest to me." The silence that followed had been suffocating. Grace had watched emotions chase across Gideon's face, grief and rage and shame, and she'd understood finally why he carried himself like someone waiting for punishment. He blamed himself, not just for Isolde's betrayal, but for having to execute her, for building a system that had forced his hand. "That was 100 years ago," Nikolai had said finally. "You've punished yourself long enough. Severin is undoing everything you achieved. He's returned to the old ways, treating humans as cattle, encouraging hunting, forbidding integration. He's making us into monsters again." "Then stop him yourselves." "We can't." Katerina had stepped closer, her icy composure cracking. "He's too strong, has too many allies. The only vampire with the power and the authority to challenge him is you. You're still the rightful king, Gideon. The old families would rally to you. We could end his reign in a month if you'd just come home." "I have no home." "Yes, you do," Grace had said quietly, and everyone had turned to stare at her again. She'd met Gideon's eyes steadily. "You have a choice. You can stay here, hiding, safe but empty. Or you can go back and try to fix what's broken. But either way, you have a home. Because home isn't a place. It's the people who care whether you're okay." Gideon had looked at her like she'd spoken a revelation. "Grace?" "I don't know anything about vampire politics," she'd continued, "but I know you. You're not a coward, whatever you think. You're someone who cares so deeply that you'd rather hurt yourself than risk hurting others. But sometimes caring means facing the hard things." "You don't understand what you're asking." "Then explain it to me." He'd stared at her for a long moment, something desperate in his eyes. Then he'd turned to the others. "Give us a moment. Wait outside." Katerina had looked like she wanted to argue, but Mikhail had grabbed her arm. "Come on, let them talk." The three vampires had filed out, and Grace had found herself alone with Gideon in the front hall, the air between them charged with tension. "I'm a vampire," he'd said bluntly, in case that wasn't clear. "I'd figured that out. And I was king. For 3 centuries, I ruled the Covenant, which is the collective term for vampire society in Europe and the Americas. I spent those centuries trying to drag us into modernity, to create laws and structures that would let us live alongside humans without the constant threat of discovery or violence. I believed we could be better than our base nature." "That sounds noble." "It was naive," he'd corrected harshly. "I thought if I just worked hard enough, cared enough, I could change centuries of tradition. Instead, I made enemies. And the person I trusted most decided I was a threat to our survival and tried to have me killed." Grace had reached out and taken his hand, feeling the coolness of his skin, the inhuman stillness beneath it. "So you walked away." "I couldn't stay. Every time I looked at the throne, I saw her. Every decision I made, I questioned whether I was blind again, missing obvious signs. I was paralyzed, Grace. Useless. So I abdicated to my cousin Severin, who promised to maintain my reforms, and I left. And he lied. Apparently. Gideon had looked down at their joined hands like he couldn't quite believe she was touching him willingly. "They want me to go back, to challenge him for the throne, to fight, probably to kill and to rule again. What do you want?" "I want to stay here," he'd said immediately. "I want to keep coming to your kitchen every night and pretend I'm someone normal. I want to hold coffee I can't drink and listen to you talk about your day. I want this simple, small life where no one depends on me and I can't fail anyone." Grace had squeezed his hand. "That's not really what you want. That's just what feels safe. Maybe safe is enough. It isn't. Not for you." She'd met his eyes, willing him to understand. "You're miserable, Gideon. You've been miserable since the day you walked through that door. Hiding isn't healing, it's just slower dying. And you think going back will heal me? Returning to the place where everything fell apart?" "I think running forever will definitely break you," Grace had said. "And I think fixing what's wrong, stopping this Severin person, might give you a purpose again, might help you forgive yourself." "I don't deserve forgiveness." "Everyone deserves forgiveness," she'd countered, "especially from themselves." He'd pulled his hand free, pacing away from her. "You make it sound simple. It isn't. If I go back, I'm committing to war, to violence, to all the things I tried to move us past. Sometimes you have to fight for peace. And what about you? He'd turned on her suddenly, his expression fierce. If I leave, I'll be walking into danger. There's a very real chance I won't come back. I could die in the challenge. Severin could have me killed before I even reach the court, and if I somehow survive and reclaim the throne, I'll be trapped there, bound by duty and responsibility. I won't be able to return here, Grace. I won't be able to see you again. The words had hung between them, heavy with meaning. Grace had felt her breath catch. Is that what you want? To see me again? Yes. The word had been torn from him. Yes. You're the first person in a century who's made me feel like something other than a failure. You look at me and you see someone worth knowing, worth talking to, worth those ridiculous sticky notes about coffee. I don't want to lose that. I don't want to lose you. Grace's heart had hammered against her ribs. Then don't. I just explained. Come back, she'd interrupted. After, when it's done, whatever happens, come back. Grace, I can't promise. I'm not asking for a promise, she'd said. I'm asking for hope. Go do what you need to do. Save your people. Be the king you were supposed to be. And when it's over, if you can, come find me. I'll be here. Gideon had stared at her like she was something miraculous and terrible. Why? Why would you wait? You barely know me. I know enough. She'd closed the distance between them, reaching up to touch his face, and feeling the sharp angles of his cheekbones, the cool silk of his skin. I know you're kind and sad and trying so hard to be good that you've forgotten how to be happy. I know you hold coffee you can't drink because it makes you feel human. I know you've kept a sticky note I wrote on impulse because it meant something to you. That's enough. You're extraordinary, he'd whispered. Do you know that? I'm really not. I'm just a girl who runs a boarding house and makes decent bread. You're everything. He'd covered her hand with his own, leaning into her touch. If I go back, if I somehow survive this and reclaim the throne, I'll be a king again. I'll have responsibilities, a court, endless demands on my time and attention. It won't be simple or peaceful or easy. I don't need easy. What do you need? Grace had smiled, feeling the truth of it in her bones. I need you to stop hiding. I need you to believe you're worth fighting for. And I need you to understand that small kindnesses, the kind you think don't matter, matter more than any throne. He'd kissed her then, sudden and desperate, one hand cradling the back of her head while the other pulled her close. His mouth had been cool and urgent against hers, and Grace had felt the careful control he maintained every moment threatened to shatter. She'd kissed him back, pouring everything she couldn't say into the contact, and had felt him tremble. When they'd finally broken apart, both breathing hard, or rather, Grace breathing hard, while Gideon simply pressed his forehead to hers, he'd spoken quietly. If I do this, I'm doing it as much for you as for them. You understand that? I understand. And you'll be here when I return, however long it takes. I'll be here. He'd kissed her again, gentler this time, achingly tender. Then he'd stepped back, straightening his shoulders, and some of the weight had lifted from his expression. All right? Tell them I'll go. Grace had smiled even as her chest constricted with fear and hope tangled together. Tell them yourself. I need to finish cleaning the kitchen. She'd walked away then, back through the swinging door, and had stood at the sink with her hands braced against the counter, listening to the muffled voices from the hall, listening to Gideon accept his destiny, listening to him leave. He'd appeared in the kitchen doorway 10 minutes later, dressed in a long coat she'd never seen before, looking every inch the king he'd claimed to have stopped being. I'm going. They have a car waiting. Okay. Grace? Come back, she'd said firmly. That's all. Just come back. He'd crossed to her in 3 strides, kissed her hard enough to bruise, and then he was gone. That had been 4 months ago. 4 months of silence. 4 months of running the boarding house and baking bread, and trying not to imagine all the terrible ways Gideon could have been killed. 4 months of lying awake at night, staring at the ceiling, wondering if she'd been a fool to let him go, to believe he'd return. The other tenants had asked about him at first. Grace had told them he'd had to leave suddenly, family emergency, and they'd accepted it without question. Her father had asked why she seemed so sad lately, and she'd lied and said she was fine. There was no way to explain that she'd fallen in love with a vampire king who'd walked back into a war for her sake. She'd kept herself busy, repainted the upstairs hallway, reorganized the pantry, perfected a new bread recipe, anything to avoid thinking about Gideon, though of course he was all she thought about. And then, on a Tuesday evening in early spring when the air smelled like rain and growing things, she'd been in the kitchen making coffee, always making coffee, because it made her feel close to him somehow when the back door had opened. She'd turned, some automatic greeting on her lips, and had frozen. Gideon stood in the doorway, still pale as moonlight, but somehow more solid than he'd been before. He'd been dressed in dark clothes that looked expensive and moved like armor, his silver hair pulled back from his face, and there had been new scars on his hands that hadn't been there before. But his eyes, those storm-gray eyes, had been fixed on her with an intensity that stole her breath. "You came back," she'd whispered. "I came back," he'd agreed roughly. "May I come in?" Grace had laughed, the sound breaking on a sob, and she'd crossed the kitchen in a rush, throwing herself at him. He'd caught her easily, arms banding around her waist, lifting her off her feet as he buried his face in her hair. "I'm here," he'd murmured against her temple. "I'm here. I'm sorry it took so long. I'm here." "Tell me everything," Grace had demanded when she'd finally pulled back enough to see his face. "What happened? Did you win? Is it over?" "It's over." He'd set her down gently but kept his hands on her waist, as if afraid to let go. "Severin is dead. I challenged him according to the old laws, and we fought, and I won. It took weeks to track him down, and then more weeks to consolidate power afterward, to make sure his supporters couldn't regroup. But it's done. The Covenant is stable again. And you're king." "I'm king," he'd confirmed, and there had been something complicated in his expression. "Which is why I'm here. Grace, I need to ask you something, and I need you to think very carefully before you answer." Her heart had stuttered. "Okay. I'm going to rule differently this time," Gideon had said. "I'm keeping all the reforms I implemented before, but I'm adding new ones. Laws about integration, about protecting humans, about holding vampires accountable when they cause harm. I'm building the kind of court that doesn't just coexist with the human world, but learns from it, values the things humans value, kindness, compassion, small gestures that make life bearable." "That sounds wonderful." "It's going to be difficult," he'd warned. "I'll have enemies, vampires who think I'm a traitor to our nature. I'll be constantly fighting tradition and prejudice and fear. It will never be easy or peaceful. You've said that before." "I know, but this time, I'm asking you to be part of it." He'd taken her hands, holding them carefully. "Come with me, Grace, not as a subject or a bystander, but as my partner, my queen." Grace had stared at him, her mind struggling to process the words. "Your queen? You mean—" "I mean I love you," Gideon had said, and his voice had shaken. "I mean, you taught me that small kindnesses matter more than crowns, and I want to build a reign based on that principle. I mean, I spent 4 months fighting to reclaim a throne I didn't even want, and the only thing that kept me going was the promise of coming back to you. I mean, you're the bravest, kindest, most extraordinary person I've ever met, and I want to spend whatever forever I have making sure you know that." "I'm human," Grace had pointed out, though her heart had been soaring. "I'll age. I'll die. I know. Believe me, I've thought about it constantly. There are ways, if you wanted. I could turn you, make you immortal. But that would be your choice, always. I won't take your humanity from you. If you come with me as you are, I'll love you for whatever time we have, and when you're gone, I'll grieve you for the rest of my existence. Either way, you'll be my queen." "That's a terrible deal for you." "That's the best deal I've ever been offered," he'd corrected fiercely. "Grace, I've lived for 4 centuries. I've had wealth and power and everything the world considers valuable, and none of it meant anything until you left me a sticky note about coffee. You made me feel human again. You made me want to be better. If I can have 30 years with you, 50 years, however many you'll give me, that will be worth more than centuries of empty immortality." Grace had felt tears spill down her cheeks. "You really kept it? The sticky note?" "I keep it in a book of poetry. I take it out every night and remember that someone looked at me and saw something worth being kind to." He'd brushed away her tears with his thumbs. "So yes, I kept it. And if you say no, if you tell me this is insane and you want your quiet life here, I'll accept that. But I had to ask, I had to try. You're supposed to be able to read my mind or something, Grace had said shakily, because I have no idea how to explain what I'm feeling right now. I can't read minds, but I can read you. So tell me, Grace Holloway, what are you feeling? She'd laughed through her tears, terrified, excited, completely overwhelmed, and absolutely certain that I love you too, you ridiculous vampire king. His face had transformed, hope and joy chasing away centuries of grief. Is that a yes? That's a yes, on one condition. Name it. The throne room, or whatever royal space you have, needs a kitchen. A real one, where I can bake bread and make terrible coffee. Because if I'm going to be a queen, I'm going to be the kind who still gets flour on her elbows. Gideon had laughed, the sound bright and incredulous. Done. I'll have one installed immediately, the best kitchen money can buy. And you'll let me teach you to make bread, since you can't eat it, but you should at least know how. I'll be your most dedicated student. And we'll visit here sometimes? I can't just abandon my father. We'll visit as often as you like. Your father can visit us as well if he wishes. I'll make sure he's cared for. Grace had pulled him down into another kiss, this one sweet and sure, full of promise. Then yes, absolutely yes, let's go be ridiculous vampire royalty together. They'd left a week later, after Grace had explained everything to her father, who'd taken the news of vampires existing with surprising calm and arranged for a manager to take over the boarding house. Gideon had been endlessly patient, helping her pack, answering her thousands of questions about vampire society, promising and re-promising that she could change her mind at any time. But Grace hadn't wanted to change her mind. She'd wanted this strange, impossible adventure with this man who held coffee he couldn't drink and kept sticky notes like treasure. The vampire court had been everything she'd imagined and nothing like it at the same time. It was located beneath Paris, a vast complex of tunnels and chambers carved from stone, lit by modern electricity but decorated with furniture and art spanning centuries. The vampires who lived there were terrifying and beautiful, ancient and proud, and they'd stared at Grace like she was a fascinating specimen when Gideon had introduced her as their future queen. There had been resistance, of course. Objections from old families who thought a human queen was an insult. Whispers about Gideon's judgment, his sanity, his fitness to rule. But he'd faced it all with a calm authority that reminded Grace why he'd been king for so long. He'd made it clear that Grace was not negotiable, that the court would accept her or answer to him, and slowly, grudgingly, they had. Katerina had become an unlikely ally, apparently charmed by Grace's refusal to be intimidated. Mikhail had appointed himself her unofficial bodyguard, claiming someone needed to make sure the brave little human didn't accidentally wander into trouble. Even Nikolai, who'd called Gideon a coward, had softened, admitting quietly that Grace's presence had changed the king for the better. The coronation had been a spectacle, all ancient ritual and modern pageantry blended together. Grace had worn a dress that cost more than everything she'd owned in her life combined, had knelt before Gideon in a chamber full of vampires, and had felt his hands steady and sure as he'd placed a crown on her head. "I crown you Grace of House Korvath," he'd said, his voice carrying through the vast space. "Queen consort of the covenant, protector of the peace, voice of compassion, my partner in all things." She'd risen to applause that had been more dutiful than enthusiastic, but she hadn't cared. She'd looked at Gideon and seen her whole future in his eyes. The months that followed had been chaotic and wonderful and exhausting. Grace had thrown herself into learning everything about her new role, about vampire history and politics and law. She'd sat in on council meetings, asked 10,000 questions, and made it clear that she wouldn't be a decorative queen. She had opinions, and she intended to share them. More importantly, she'd kept her promise to herself. She'd had a kitchen installed in their private quarters, a beautiful space with modern appliances and plenty of room to work. She'd baked bread every week, filling the royal chambers with the scent of cardamom and cinnamon. She'd made coffee every morning, and Gideon had sat at the counter holding a mug he didn't drink, watching her with an expression that never failed to make her chest warm. They'd work together to implement changes, incremental but meaningful. Programs to help young vampires adapt to modern society. Educational exchanges with trusted humans who knew about the covenant. Stricter enforcement of the laws against hunting. It was slow, often frustrating work, but it was important. It mattered. And at night, when the court was quiet and they were alone, Gideon would tell her about his past. About his mother, who'd baked with cardamom, who died when he was still human centuries ago. About his transformation, his rise to power, his long reign. About Isolde's betrayal and the execution that had broken him. Grace would listen and hold him and remind him that he was allowed to grieve, allowed to hurt, allowed to heal at his own pace. She'd tell him about her mother, about dropping out of university, about the small joys she'd found in running a boarding house. They'd share their scars and their hopes, and Grace would marvel at how this impossible love had become the most real thing in her life. On their first anniversary together, Grace had come down to the kitchen early to find Gideon already there, standing by the counter with something in his hands. He'd turned when she entered, and she'd seen that it was the book, the one from his room at the boarding house, the one with the sticky note pressed inside. "I've been thinking," he had said quietly. "That note was the first time in a century that anyone saw me as something other than a king or a monster. You saw me as just a person, someone who might want coffee and company." Grace had crossed to him, wrapping her arms around his waist. "You are just a person. An extraordinary, complicated, wonderful person, but still just a person." "I want to frame it," Gideon had said. "The note. I want to hang it somewhere in this kitchen so we never forget where we started. Would that be all right?" Grace had felt her eyes sting with tears. "More than all right. I think it's perfect." So they'd framed it, that yellowed sticky note with its cheerful message, and had hung it by the kitchen door where they'd see it every day. A reminder that the smallest gestures of kindness could change everything, that crowns and power and immortality mattered less than being seen, being known, being loved. Now, 2 years after Gideon had walked into her boarding house looking like a ghost, Grace stood in the royal kitchen pouring coffee while dawn broke somewhere far above the underground court. Gideon sat at the counter, silver hair loose around his shoulders, holding his mug with both hands and watching her with those storm-gray eyes that still made her breath catch. "What are you thinking?" she asked, setting the pot aside. "That I'm grateful," he said simply. "That out of 4 centuries of existence, the best decision I ever made was walking into a boarding house on Ashford Street. That you saved me in ways you'll never fully understand." Grace moved around the counter to stand between his knees, taking his face in her hands. "You saved yourself. I just reminded you that you were worth saving." "You remind me every day," he murmured, pulling her close. "With every loaf of bread, every pot of coffee, every time you smile at me like I'm not a monster." "You're not a monster. You're mine." He kissed her then, soft and reverent, and Grace let herself sink into it. Into this impossible life they'd built together, this strange, beautiful love between a human and a vampire king. This future that had started with a sticky note and a simple offer of coffee. From the corner of her eye, she could see the framed note hanging on the wall, its message clear even from a distance. "Coffee's ready. It always would be." They'd talked early on about whether Grace would choose immortality. Gideon had been careful to present it as entirely her decision, had brought in vampires who could explain the transformation process, the pros and cons, the things she'd gain and lose. He'd made it clear he would love her regardless of what she chose. Grace had thought about it seriously, had weighed the appeal of forever against the value of a natural human life. In the end, she'd decided to wait, to live as a human for now, to see how she felt in another decade, another 20 years. Gideon had accepted her choice with grace, though she'd seen the flash of grief in his eyes when he'd thought she wasn't looking. "Hey," she'd said, taking his hand, "I'm not saying no. I'm saying not yet. We have time." "All the time you want," he'd agreed. But that had been the beauty of their relationship, Grace thought, as she watched him now in the early morning light of their kitchen. They didn't take each other for granted. They savored every day, every moment, because they both understood how precious and fragile connection could be. Gideon had lost someone he loved to betrayal. Grace had lost her mother to illness. They knew that forever was never guaranteed, whether you were immortal or not. So they chose each other, every day, in the small kindnesses and the grand gestures, in the way Gideon made sure Grace had fresh flowers in their chambers because she missed her garden, in the way Grace learned to read ancient vampire texts so she could help Gideon with his research, in the way they'd built a life that honored both the human and vampire parts of who they were. The court had grown to accept Grace, eventually. More than accept her, they'd come to respect her. She'd proven herself shrewd in council meetings, compassionate in her judgments when vampires brought disputes to the throne, and utterly fearless when it came to defending the reforms she believed in. She'd won allies among the younger vampires who wanted change, and grudging admiration from the older ones who valued strength. There had been challenges, of course. Assassination attempts, though Gideon's protective instincts and Michael's vigilance had foiled them all. Political maneuvering from families who thought they could manipulate the human queen. One memorable incident where Grace had physically thrown a vampire out of a council meeting for suggesting they reinstate hunting laws. You do realize you just bodily ejected a vampire who's been alive since the Renaissance, Gideon had said afterward, torn between horror and laughter. He was being an ass, Grace had replied calmly, and I work out. Also, he wasn't expecting it. Element of surprise. Katerina had howled with laughter at that, and the story had spread through the court like wildfire. The human queen who'd thrown a vampire twice her size out of a meeting. It had done more for her reputation than any number of shrewd political moves. But beyond the politics and the challenges, what Grace loved most was the quiet moments. The evenings spent reading together in their chambers, Gideon working through legal documents while Grace studied vampire history. The nights when he'd take her dancing in the court's grand ballroom, all of them moving to music that spanned centuries. The times he'd take her to the surface to walk through Paris at night, showing her his favorite places from across the decades. He'd shown her the house where he'd been born 400 years ago, now a museum. The church where he'd been baptized, still standing. The park where he'd proposed to Isolde, which he'd avoided for a century until Grace had taken his hand and walked through it with him, reclaiming the space. Thank you, he'd said quietly, standing by the fountain where he'd once knelt with a ring. For what? For not being afraid of my past, for helping me face it instead of hiding from it. Grace had squeezed his hand. Your past made you who you are. I'm not afraid of it. I'm grateful for it because it brought you to me. They'd married properly 6 months after her coronation, both a vampire ceremony and a human one, because Grace had wanted her father to be able to witness it in a context he understood. It had been beautiful and strange and perfect, a blend of traditions that represented everything they were building together. Gregory Holloway had walked his daughter down an aisle lined with vampires, had placed her hand in Gideon's with tears streaming down his face, and had told the vampire king quietly, "You take care of my girl." With my life, Gideon had promised, and he'd meant it. The years had begun to pass, and Grace had found a rhythm to her new life. She'd started programs to help humans who'd been accidentally exposed to vampire society, offering them support and resources. She'd worked with Gideon to create scholarships for young vampires who wanted to study in human universities. She'd even convinced the council to open a small bakery on the surface, run by the court, as a way of integrating more naturally with the human community. You want to open a bakery, Nikolai had said flatly. The Vampire Covenant, ancient and powerful, is going to run a bakery. Why not? Grace had challenged. We need better cover businesses anyway. Everyone loves fresh bread. It's perfect. The bakery had become wildly popular, and Gideon had never let Nikolai live down his skepticism. But for all the grand changes and political maneuvering, Grace's favorite part of being queen was still the kitchen. Their private kitchen, where the sticky note hung framed by the door and where she could be just Grace instead of Queen Grace. Where Gideon would sit and hold his coffee and look at her like she'd hung the moon. What are we doing today? She asked now, settling onto the stool next to him. Council meeting at 10, Gideon said, consulting the mental list he seemed to keep constantly updated. Then I need to review the new integration proposals, and this evening there's a reception for the delegation from the Eastern Covenant. Sounds exhausting. It is, but we'll manage. He set down his mug and pulled her closer, pressing a kiss to her temple. We always do. Together, Grace agreed. Together. It was their promise to each other, the foundation of everything they'd built. Together, they could face anything. Together, they were stronger than any challenge the vampire world could throw at them. Together, they'd created something new and precious and worth fighting for. As the morning light filtered down through the ventilation shafts that brought air and faint sunlight to the underground court, Grace looked at the framed sticky note and smiled. Coffee's ready. Such a simple message, such an ordinary gesture. And yet it had changed everything, because Gideon had been right that first night in her boarding house kitchen. Small kindnesses did matter more than crowns. They mattered because they reminded you that you were seen, that you were valued, that you were worth someone's time and care. Grace had given Gideon that reminder with a sticky note and a pot of coffee he'd never drink, and he'd given her a love that spanned the gap between mortal and immortal, human and vampire, ordinary and extraordinary. They'd built a life together that honored both their worlds, that valued kindness and strength in equal measure, that proved you could be powerful without losing your compassion. And every morning, when Grace made coffee in their kitchen and Gideon held his mug and smiled at her with those ancient loving eyes, she felt grateful beyond measure for the strange path that had brought them together. "I love you," she said softly. "I love you," Gideon replied, "for today and tomorrow and whatever time we have." "Forever starts with today," Grace pointed out. "So let's make it good." He laughed and pulled her into a kiss that tasted like promise and possibility. And somewhere above them, the world turned, full of humans going about their ordinary lives, never knowing that beneath the streets of Paris, a vampire king and his human queen were rewriting the rules of forever, one small kindness at a time. The sticky note stayed pressed in its book for 100 years before Gideon had framed it, but now it hung in a place of honor, a reminder that the smallest gestures could hold the greatest meaning. That love could grow from the simplest moments. That home wasn't a throne or a castle, but rather the warmth of a kitchen and the presence of someone who saw you truly. Grace had left a sticky note about coffee, and a vampire king had kept it like a treasure. And from that small beginning, they'd built something magnificent. In the end, that was the story Grace would tell when courtiers asked about their relationship, not about thrones or battles or political maneuvering, though those were part of it too. She'd tell them about a boarding house on Ashford Street and a stranger with sad eyes who'd needed kindness more than he'd needed power. She'd tell them about coffee that was never drunk but always appreciated, about how the smallest acts of compassion could heal the deepest wounds. And she'd tell them that love, real love, wasn't about grand gestures or sweeping declarations. It was about showing up every day, about seeing someone's pain and choosing to offer comfort anyway, about holding space for both strength and vulnerability. That was what the sticky note represented. That was why Gideon had kept it. Not because it was profound or eloquent, but because it was proof that someone had seen him and cared. And in a life that spanned centuries, in a world where power and politics often overshadowed everything else, that kind of caring was the most revolutionary act of all. So the note hung in the kitchen, a small yellow square with fading ink and curled edges, and every time Grace or Gideon passed it, they remembered. Remembered where they'd started. Remembered what mattered most. Remembered that forever could begin with something as simple as coffee and kindness. And every morning, Grace would make a fresh pot, and Gideon would sit at the counter with his mug, and they'd face whatever challenges the day brought together, knowing that they'd found something rare and precious in each other. A love built on small moments and quiet gestures. A love that proved that sometimes the most powerful magic wasn't in ancient vampire abilities or immortal strength. Sometimes the most powerful magic was simply choosing to be kind, to see someone's need and meet it without expectation of reward, to offer coffee to a stranger and change the course of forever. That was the story of Grace and Gideon, the human queen and the vampire king who'd found each other in a boarding house kitchen and built a life that honored both their worlds. And it all started with a sticky note and 3 simple words: "Coffee's ready." Those words had been ready too, Grace thought as she watched the sun slowly rise through the distant skylights, ready to heal, ready to love, ready to face whatever came next, together. The coffee was always ready, and so were they.